On October 11th, 1969, a document was created that would later become part of one of the most examined criminal case files in American history. The document was not written for the public. It was not intended to explain events or provide conclusions. It was an internal memorandum. The page originates from an FBI file released years later under the Freedom of Information Act. Its purpose was simple: to record how evidence related to the Zodiac case was being handled at that moment in time. What makes this document important is not what it claims, but what it reveals about process. It lists physical items and written materials submitted in cooperation with the Vallejo Police Department. Some items were examined for latent fingerprints by local police. Others were not examined immediately and were forwarded for additional processing. The document also references ciphers that were enclosed with several items. These ciphers were submitted to another department, but had not yet been examined by a cryptographer. This detail matters. It shows that the presence of evidence did not automatically result in immediate analysis. Examination occurred in stages, shaped by priority, resources, and jurisdiction. The memorandum further notes that police officials were of the opinion that the letters were written by the person responsible for previous attacks. The language is careful. It is clearly labeled as opinion, not conclusion. No determination is made. No certainty is claimed. Instead, the memo requests that the letters and ciphers be compared with other threatening communications already submitted to the FBI laboratory. This tells us that, at this early stage, the investigation was still organizing information rather than resolving it. Understanding this distinction is essential because it defines how the case began, not as a solved narrative, but as an open file. Part 2: How evidence moved, not what it proved. The FBI memorandum does not describe crimes in detail. It describes movement. Evidence moved between agencies. Responsibilities shifted. Examinations were requested, delayed, or deferred. Items were submitted through the Vallejo Police Department. Some were examined locally for fingerprints. Others were forwarded for further processing, suggesting that not all materials were treated with equal urgency. This does not imply neglect. It reflects structure. Different agencies handled different aspects of the case, and the document shows that this coordination was still being established. The ciphers referenced in the memorandum illustrate this clearly. They were transmitted for review, but had not yet been examined by a cryptographer. At this stage, their significance was undetermined. The document does not describe the ciphers as threatening, meaningful, or central. It simply records that they exist and require evaluation. This is important because later, narratives often place enormous weight on these materials. Here, they are presented as unresolved items within a larger administrative process. The memo also emphasizes comparison. It requests that letters and ciphers be evaluated alongside other threatening communications already held by the FBI laboratory. This suggests that investigators were still asking a fundamental question. Do these materials belong to a known pattern, or are they something new? At this point, the file offers no answer. What we see instead is an investigation focused on classification, sorting, routing, and determining relevance, rather than drawing conclusions. The significance of this stage is often overlooked, yet it is here, in the handling of evidence, that investigative direction begins to take shape. One of the most revealing aspects of the document is its language. The memorandum states that police officials were of the opinion that the letters were written by the person responsible for previous attacks. This wording is precise. It does not state that the letters were confirmed to be authentic. It does not state that authorship was established. It records an opinion held at that time. This distinction matters more than it appears. Opinions guide investigative focus, but they are not findings. When opinions are later repeated without context, they can begin to resemble conclusions. In this document, the difference is still intact. The memo continues by requesting further comparison of the letters and ciphers with other threatening communications submitted to the FBI laboratory. This indicates uncertainty rather than confidence. If authorship had been established, comparison would not be necessary. Instead, the investigation was still testing assumptions. This moment represents a transitional phase. The case was no longer limited to isolated incidents, but it had not yet solidified into a single, unified narrative. The document preserves that uncertainty. Later summaries often compress this stage, presenting a smoother progression from event to conclusion. The original file does not. It shows hesitation, process, and unanswered questions. Recognizing this difference is essential because it reveals how much of the case was still unresolved at the time these early decisions were made. Near the end of the memorandum, a line appears that is easy to overlook. It states that all items should be returned to the Vallejo Police Department upon completion of examination, and that no active investigation was being conducted by Sacramento, nor was any requested of San Francisco at that time. This sentence is not dramatic. It does not describe failure or success, but it is significant. It indicates that, at this stage, investigative responsibility was limited. Certain jurisdictions were not actively pursuing the case, and no formal request had been made for their involvement. This does not imply that the case was abandoned. It suggests that the scope of active investigation was narrower than later narratives imply. Understanding this helps explain why some leads were not immediately pursued and why certain materials remained unexamined for extended periods. The document reflects an investigation that was still defining its boundaries. Later, as correspondence continued and public attention intensified, those boundaries would change. But here, the file shows restraint. No escalation is recorded. No expansion is ordered. The investigation at this point was still cautious, procedural, and limited in reach. This context matters because it frames everything that followed. Decisions made during this period influenced how evidence was interpreted, prioritized, and revisited, or not revisited, later. The Zodiac case remains unresolved, not because documentation is absent, but because early decisions shaped how documentation was used. The memorandum examined here does not solve the case. It does not identify a suspect, does not offer conclusions. What it provides is a snapshot of process. It shows an investigation in motion, still organizing itself, still weighing possibilities, still uncertain about significance. Many later interpretations assume clarity from the beginning. The original file does not support that assumption. Instead, it reveals caution, limitation, and unanswered questions. This matters because unresolved cases are often discussed in terms of missing evidence. In reality, they are more often shaped by how existing evidence was handled at critical moments. The document preserves one of those moments. It reminds us that the case did not begin as a finished narrative, but as an open file, one that would later accumulate meaning through repetition, interpretation, and public attention. Understanding how that process began is essential to understanding why it never reached a definitive end. And this is only the first layer of the file.